Remember, we're trending in Saskatchewan province, so.
Where is that?
Canada.
Doesn't matter.
We're what a cynic. What a jaded remark. Doesn't matter.
No, I was getting the spirit of Dostoevsky.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's my job.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Where we were in the last class, we were looking at Dostoevsky's, I wouldn't call it indictment of the idea of reason. I would call it Dostoevsky posing real, genuine questions about trying to construct a world based upon a theory that's been contrived in our minds and which seems to discard, overlook, omit the other large part of ourselves which is not easily bent to reason, and which Dostoevsky thinks it's probably not desirable that we conform to reason. And if we did, by some miracle, construct a world that was reasonable, Dostoevsky says that in our fancy and in our recalcitrance would probably destroy it. And the book is really, the little book is divided really into three parts. The funniest and the cleverest is the part we're not going to look at, which is the last part, part 2, which is a kind of a little dramatic enactment of his theory. A fellow who takes offense at another person, his superior, and then imagines that he's returned the offense, and everything is just going on in his mind. In the real world, nothing has actually happened. And the first part is, I think it combines two things. Right now we're looking at the first half and how Dostoevsky, in a very subtle way, already as class began, Cecilia complained at the magnitude of the assignment I gave. After teaching for 5 weeks, I assigned 37 pages, and Cecilia was already ready to report me to the president of the library for cruel and unusual punishment. Need I say more? No, thank you, you're correct. So last week we were looking at the various ways in which Dostoevsky illustrates his point. I was rude and enjoyed being rude. I lied out of spite. He goes on at some length about how people act in ways which are totally irrational, but nonetheless, they can't be cured by our reason. They are just impulsive, instinctive responses. Last week, Carrington, is she here? Yeah. Oh, I didn't see you, okay. Last week, Carrington, I think correctly said, well, sometimes adolescents go through a phase where they act in a certain irrational way, they're defiant, they're stubborn, and you can find a kind of rational explanation for it. And yes, I think it's true, as she said, in certain instances you can find an explanation. But then there are often cases where we just lie and are spiteful or whatever else for no obvious reason. And then on page 12, he gives another kind of example. I have to confess that I am reading into it. I can't claim this is the correct explanation. Unfortunately, we have in our class several people who are knowledgeable in literature, and they're free, of course, to disagree with me and put on display before the world their ignorance. So he writes at one point, if you don't have a book, sit next to somebody who does. So he writes, impossibility is a stone wall. Anyone find it? It's at the very top, 4 lines down. Impossibility is a stone wall. Now, what do I mean by stone wall? Well, the laws of nature, the conclusions of natural science and mathematics, of course. Once it's proven to you, for example, that you're descended, wait, I want to just make sure. Yes. I'm going to have somebody else read it because that way I can follow along in my own text. John, go ahead. Start with impossibility.
Impossibility is a stone wall. Now, what do I mean by stone wall? Well, the laws of nature, the conclusions of natural science and mathematics, of course. Once it is proven to you, for example, that you're descended from the apes, it's no good pulling a long face. You must accept things as they are.
Now, skip a little to there's nothing you can do about it.
Where is that? Same paragraph? Oh, okay. There's nothing you can do about it since twice 2 is mathematics. Just you try and refute it.
And now skip 2 if you don't mind.
Okay, the next line.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, they'll shout at you. You can't fight it. This is twice 2 is 4. Nature doesn't ask for your permission. She's not concerned about your wishes or whether or not you care for her laws. You are obliged to accept her as she is, and consequently, all her end results. That is a wall, etc., etc. Good heavens, what do the laws of nature and arithmetic have to do with me if, for some reason, I don't happen to like those laws, and that twice 2 is 4? Naturally, I shan't break through that wall with my forehead, if in fact I don't have the strength, but I won't capitulate simply because I'm confronted with a stone wall and don't have the strength to break through.
Okay, that's actually a quite rich passage, and you'll forgive me if I ask John to read it one more time, because now you know where we're jumping to, and I'd like to concentrate on it. Just one more time, John. Start from impossibility.
Impossibility is a stone wall. Now, what do I mean by stone wall? Well, the laws of nature, the conclusions of natural science and mathematics, of course. Once it is proven to you, for example, that you're descended from the apes, it's no good pulling a long face. You must accept things as they are. Or when they...
No, skip down to?
Skip down to... There's nothing you can do about it, since twice 2 is mathematics. Just you try and refute it. If you don't mind, they'll shout at you, you can't fight it. This is twice 2 is 4. Nature doesn't ask for your permission. She's not concerned about your wishes or whether or not you care for her laws. You are obliged to accept her as she is, and consequently all her end results. That is a wall, etc., etc. Good heavens, what do the laws of nature and arithmetic have to do with me if, for some reason, I don't happen to like those laws, and that twice 2 is 4? Naturally, I shan't break through that wall with my forehead, if in fact I don't have the strength, but I won't capitulate simply because I'm confronted with a stone wall and don't have the strength to break through.
Okay. Would anyone want to venture to suggest, what is Dostoevsky trying to say there? Anyone have a hunch? Shannon?
Save time trying to understand and just accept.
Say that again?
Save time trying to understand and just accept.
Actually, I think he's saying just the reverse. What Dostoevsky seems to be saying here is there are some things in life which you know with absolute certainty. They're like twice 2 is 4. They have been demonstrated by the laws of science and mathematics. they can't be changed. They're as certain as the sunrise and the sunset. But even as we know that we can't change it, it can't be altered, he says what, Philip?
You won't capitulate.
We won't accept it. We don't accept it. So who can think of an obvious example, which everybody in this room knows to be the case? It's as certain as twice 2 is 4. Bang your head against the wall as much as you try. You can't change it. But nonetheless, none of us, in our heart of hearts, none of us in our deepest souls, we're willing to accept it. What's the most obvious example?
Trump presidency.
What?
Trump presidency.
Trump is president? No.
I guess someone kind of said it out loud already, but death.
Very good. Who said it out loud? Yeah. It was you?
It was some consensus. I heard
I think it was the 10th grader.
Oh, we're not going the freshman.
The fresh.
What's your name?
Theodore.
Theodore? Okay. As Theodore said, and we always need the voice of youth to bring some illumination to an otherwise mentally paralyzed crowd. Yes, it's death. As certain as we are of that fact, it's the laws of nature. It's like twice 2 is 4. There is a voice inside us that sometimes whispers and oftener screams, "Not me." Everybody else, maybe, or certainly, but not me. It's impossible to accept the fact that in 50 years from now, all of you in this room is going to be reduced to dust. Exactly. And I know I often I'm seized by the fact of my mortality at some time. Usually it's about 3 or 4 in the morning. And I get into this panic. It's when you're mentally tired and all your defense mechanisms have broken down. That's when it hits you hardest, because the human consciousness is constructed like Star Trek's deflector shields. You have 10 deflector shields, and as you get more and more exhausted, one deflector shield goes down, then the next, until there are none left, and you can no longer be in denial. Me. And that's why I say, what is life? No, excuse me. What is depression if not life stripped of its illusions? Those deflector shields are the illusions. But says Dostoevsky, you know it, I know it, but it doesn't change at all the fact that we deny it. Reason cannot be more compelling on that point. There are 6 million years of proof that we're all going to go that way. I just fight it by saying, not me, they're going to invent a drug, and I go back to sleep.
But people who are terminally ill accept their deaths all the time. I've seen that. They stop resisting at a certain point. Maybe not everyone will, but I've seen people stop resisting that.
I agree with that. But I think you kind of proved the point that you have to be terminally ill before you accept it. Human beings in their normal, healthy condition will not. In my mother's case, it occurred 2 nights before she passed away. My brother told me she called up my nephew and said goodbye after fighting, resisting, and then died. But that's when you're already on the way out.
Well,
Shan?
in that case, that would be, I don't know, in that case, that would be the stone wall. Right. Terminal illness would be the stone wall that you're faced with, that you.
Yes, that's true. She banged her head against that stone wall of an illness that she couldn't stop. And then she accepted it. Yes. Go ahead. You're going to forgive me. I forgot the name because you were absent last week. Melissa. Okay.
Well, just going to say, I agree with everything that's being said, and death being inevitability and impossibility with the wording. But I guess I'm not understanding how that reading is relevant to this, because I would think that for the reading that we're doing, you actually have to look at the line that comes before, even where we started reading, because it seems like he's actually, like, the speaker is comparing himself as a character to, like, the exception of the rule. So I actually don't know that death is a good example.
Yes, he is. He's saying, even if somebody comes along and tells you, you can't fight it. Twice 2 is 4. Nature doesn't ask for your permission. You are obliged to accept her. And then he replies in indignation, good heavens, what do the laws of nature and arithmetic have to do with me? If for some reason I don't happen to like those laws and that twice 2 is 4. Naturally, I shan't break through that wall with my forehead. I won't be able to resist it. But he says, I won't capitulate. I won't accept it.
Well, exactly, and I see that, but that goes back to the line right before where we started reading, which is where he's saying that, you know, compared to these gentlemen who may roar full-throatedly like bulls, and although this supposedly does them the greatest credit, when confronted with an impossibility, they immediately capitulate. And he's using that as kind of an example against their character, saying they're a bit of a hypocrites, almost, and then comparing himself to them.
You might be right. I'd have to reread it, and I can't do it now because my mind won't focus. I'd have to sit down and look at it. Okay.
Wait.
Yes, go ahead, Carrington.
Apparently there's a thing that happens with people who have been told by their doctors that they have 2 months to live, and the people who believe it will die 2 months later, and the ones who don't believe it won't necessarily. There's some sort of correlation. I just thought that was sort of relevant. The people who refuse.
And the people
like
who
Dostoevsky.
refuse. Well, I want to know this for the future.
No, I had a friend who had cancer.
If I refuse, you think?
I had a friend who had cancer.
Now I know what to do at 3 a.m. I'm going to just refuse. Go ahead.
Right. She was given, say, 2 months to live. And, you know, she lived, like, a year later, she got a call from Sloan Kettering saying, like, how is it you're still alive? But apparently, like, accountants are more likely to die. According to what the doctor says, they'll die. And it's just a statistical fact.
Accountants?
Well, people who are more sort of matter of fact.
I'm glad you told me that, because one of my accountants, I'm gonna tell him he's got 2 more weeks to live. Can you take that off? Cut that. What if he dies in 2 weeks, you know, on camera? I'm in trouble. Go ahead. As if I don't have enough troubles, Miranda.
The previous sentence is just one example of all the contradictions that are all over the text. He is trying very hard to prove to us what happened if you spend 20 years underground. So it's just one contradiction among many. And in spite of that, you should not give up. So it's not, I think.
In spite of what you shouldn't give.
Of what has happened, because you spend 20 years underground, and your mind goes the way he has done a great job showing us that his mind doesn't work anymore. It's contradictions, it's repetitions, etc. But in spite of it all, you cannot give up.
But I would probably dissent from the claim his mind doesn't work. Actually, I think his mind is working. It's a haphazard presentation, but the mind is certainly on the mark.
Literally, I mean, as a piece of literature, it's brilliant. But he is trying also to tell us that the mind doesn't work. Why? He contradicts himself every other, etc.
I would agree that's going on. That you do feel a lot of contradiction as you move forward. That's why it's a little difficult to teach. Let me give you another example and this is, Theo, you're going to have to forgive me, and I'm going to please ask you not to let your mother or father see this, because I will lose this job, and I'm down to the last now. This is my last prayer. Page 7. Tell me this. Let's see where it is. Page 7. Yes, tell me this. And actually, it does travel quite a lot to page 8. Let's start. Page 7. Wait, maybe bound to be there. Go ahead, John.
Bound.
I'll find it, just as you're going along. Tell me this.
Tell me this. Why did it invariably happen, as if deliberately, that at those very moments when I was most capable of appreciating all the subtleties of the sublime and beautiful, as we once used to say, I not only would fail to comprehend, but would perform the most contemptible actions? Well, the kind of which everyone is guilty, but which I happened to perform precisely when I was most conscious that I should not be performing them at all. The more I recognized goodness and the whole question of the sublime and beautiful, the deeper I sank into the mire and the more capable I became of completely immersing myself in it. But the main feature of all this was that it wasn't within me by accident, but as if it were bound to be there.
Okay. Now skip to page 8. It reached the point.
Where is that?
Let's see. It reached the point. Anyone see it? Well, it may actually start at the bottom. Yes, here it is. Yes.
It reached the point where I felt an abnormal, secret, base thrill of pleasure when returning to my corner on some positively foul St. Petersburg night, and I would feel intensely aware that once again I had done something vile that day, that what's done cannot be undone, and inwardly, secretly, I would keep gnawing, nibbling and eating away at myself until the bitterness finally turned into some shameful, damnable sweetness, and finally into serious, definite pleasure. Yes, pleasure. I stand by that.
Skip a little to the pleasure I experienced.
The pleasure I experienced came directly from being too vividly aware of my own degradation, from the feeling of having gone too far, that it was foul, but that it couldn't be otherwise, that there's no way out for you, that you'd never make yourself a different person, that even if there remained enough time and faith to change yourself into something different, you most probably wouldn't want to change yourself.
And now skip to I, for example. It's the next page, the first paragraph.
I, for example, am extremely touchy. I'm as suspicious and as quick to take offense as a hunchback or a dwarf. But in fact, there have been moments when, if someone had slapped my face, I might have been glad even of that. I mean this in all seriousness. Very likely, I would have managed to derive pleasure of a kind, even from that. I mean, of course, the pleasure of despair. But it's in despair that you discover the most intense pleasure, especially when you are acutely conscious of the hopelessness of your predicament. And here, too, after that slap in the face, you are crushed by the realization of what filth you're being smeared with.
Okay. I know you're puzzled by this. I'm going to just ask, read it one more time. Now you know where to jump from and to. And I'll try to go over it with you. And you're going to see there's actually something interesting going on here. That if you recall in the Utopia, More's Utopia, he had a very rational concept of pleasure. And he said the only true pleasures are good and virtuous pleasures. He acknowledged we have physical pleasures, and he said those are pleasure, but they're a pretty low form of pleasure. And then there are higher forms of pleasure. But Dostoevsky says we derive all sorts of pleasures from the strangest things. Who would have thought, rationally speaking, you would derive pleasure from being degraded? You'd derive pleasure from being humiliated. You would derive pleasure from being smeared with filth. And then he says, at our moments of our mental and moral sublimity, those moments when you're sitting in a physics class or a math class and you suddenly see the beauty of a mathematical equation, or suddenly you're able to grasp what Einstein means by that formula E equals mc squared, or you're sitting in one of Professor Finkelstein's classes and you're at that Moran, you can excuse yourself. And you experience that moment of the sublime and the best in you. There you are on a Wednesday night, contemplating the highest thoughts, the most elevated thoughts. And at the very moment when you're contemplating these thoughts, you find your mind drifting into the most sordid and lewd and lascivious of ideas start creeping into your head. Abdullah, you're looking at me puzzled. But that's because you're a good human being. Let's read it one more time, and then we're going to try to see what he's saying there.
Tell me this. Why did it invariably happen, as if deliberately, that at those very moments when I was most capable of appreciating all the subtleties of the sublime and beautiful, as we once used to say, I not only would fail to comprehend, but would perform the most contemptible actions, well, the kind of which everyone is guilty, but which I happened to perform precisely when I was most conscious that I should not be performing them at all. The more I recognized goodness and the whole question of the sublime and beautiful, the deeper I sank into the mire, and the more capable I became of completely immersing myself in it. But the main feature of all this was that it wasn't within me by accident, but as if it were bound to be there. It reached the point where I felt an abnormal, secret, base thrill of pleasure when returning to my corner on some positively foul St. Petersburg night, and I would feel intensely aware that once again I had done something vile that
He's
day.
evidently gone to a prostitute. Go ahead.
That what's done cannot be undone, and inwardly, secretly, I would keep gnawing, nibbling and eating away at myself until the bitterness finally turned into some shameful, damnable sweetness, and finally into serious, definite pleasure. Yes.
A little drama here. Yes, pleasure.
Pleasure. I stand by that. The pleasure I experienced came directly from being too vividly aware of my own degradation, from the feeling of having gone too far, that it was foul, but that it couldn't be otherwise, that there's no way out for you, that you'd never make yourself a different person, that even if there remained enough time and faith to change yourself into something different, you most probably wouldn't want to change yourself.
Okay, well, go ahead. I, for example.
I, for example, am extremely touchy. I'm as suspicious and as quick to take offense as a hunchback or a dwarf. But in fact, there have been moments when, if someone had slapped my face, I might have been glad even of that. I mean this in all seriousness. Very likely, I would have managed to derive pleasure of a kind even from that. I mean, of course, the pleasure of despair. But it's in despair that you discover the most intense pleasure. Especially
Despair of a martyr. A martyr feels pleasure in his or her despair. It's a fact. The pleasure of being martyred, evoking pity, the pleasure of despair. Go ahead. I mean, of course, the pleasure of despair.
I mean, of course, the pleasure of despair. But it's in despair that you discover the most intense pleasure, especially when you are acutely conscious of the hopelessness of your predicament. And here, too, after that slap in the face, you are crushed by the realization of what filth you're being smeared with.
Yes. So Dostoevsky is looking at two aspects. Obviously, it's not a secret. I mean, it's pretty obvious looking in retrospect. He's writing in a period we talked about last week where the rise of psychoanalysis and what particular aspects of our psyche is he talking about here? Anyone? It's pretty, Erin?
The death drive, kind of?
I don't think here it's the death drive, yes?
Masochism?
Yeah, he's talking about our masochistic and our sadistic impulses. The pleasure you derive from being humiliated, degraded. There is a pleasure in that. And he's saying that if you try to, as Moore does in Utopia, try to calculate rational pleasure, you can't factor this in. It's part of who we are. And no rational calculation or calculus can really make much sense of it. It's not like sitting in a room and listening to Beethoven or going to an art museum, going to MoMA. It's something very different. It's a different kind. It's a completely irrational pleasure. John recently announced to me that he had fallen in love, which you would think is something beautiful, something sublime. I know you're right.
Secret.
Okay, he stole my thunder with that line. But I'm resuming. And it is beautiful. It is beautiful. But who would have thought that part of the pleasure, the love that John derived from this moment, was having his girlfriend in stiletto heels and a whip, and there is John crawling on the floor like a dog, barking. Then his love. It's beautiful. He asks her to urinate on him. Morin, that's the text. Smeared with filth. Theodore, it's the text. I'm just trying to get it clear. And you ask your girlfriend to defecate on you, smeared with filth. Cecilia, it's the text. I told you to read the text before you came to class. You would have been prepared. You would have been prepared.
I read it
Okay.
I showed the Carrington, I put golden showers.
Is that true?
Yes.
I thought she was a church-goer. I don't know. Yes. And then there's Morin. She attends my classes. She's listening to me elocute on the sublime and the beautiful. And all of a sudden, her mind starts drifting, trying to imagine me naked. It's in the text. And did you read the footnote? Did you read the endnotes? And then Dostoevsky says, it's very weird because just at the moment of the sublime and the most beautiful, he says, as if invariably and inevitably, your mind starts drifting in the reverse direction, from the heavens to the gutter. Why? Because Dostoevsky says it's our irrational asserting itself. It's not normal, it's not human to just have your mind in the sublime and the beautiful. There is another side to us, that irrational side, which often finds itself in the gutter, and not in the gutter, and as he says, and he's pretty clear, I think, in the image, the pleasure you get, not just from the sublime and the beautiful, but the pleasure you get from being smeared with filth. I just heard a sigh. Calm down, calm down. We're going to get this through the censors. He's worried now that it's going to get a bad rating. Yes?
I'm having trouble seeing this.
I'm having trouble seeing this as irrational behavior.
As what?
As irrational. Irrational. If you're viewing this behavior against some objective moral framework, I understand it. But subjectively to that person, you know, what someone likes, they like. You know, what they're drawn to, they're drawn to. You know, you can make some kind of external observation, whether it's good or bad, or filthy or pure, or right or wrong, or sublime or degrading. But in an individual human experience, to me, someone might be drawn to something that they find sublime. Is it really sublime? I mean, we're making some kind of a judgment call. So so I'm just curious about framing this from a vantage point of rationality.
Right. I understand entirely what you're saying. I think what Dostoevsky is doing here is he's, as we'll see in a moment, I'll illustrate, he's reacting to a notion of creating a perfect world based on a calculation of what are rational pleasures. This is how we're going to organize the world, and the world will be constructed on the basis of enabling everybody to experience happiness based on their rational pleasures. And there's a certain conventional view about rational pleasures. There is the conventional view, there are our bodily appetites, and then there is a gradual hierarchy until you reach those most elevated pleasures of the mind and the aesthetic faculty. And now Dostoevsky throws a ringer into the works, and he says, well, that's not really true. You can get pleasure from all sorts of things that are not rational or even elevated pleasures. You can get pleasure from despair. You can get pleasure from being humiliated, degraded, a smack in the face, smeared with feces, and all the rest. That's, as he'll say later, that can't fit into any rational account of who we are, but hey, that's who we are. I'll quote those passages. We'll just put it on hold. I'm not going to answer it because I'd rather, Dostoevsky's language is much more eloquent than my own, and I'd rather be able to quote him. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Can I ask a question about the sublime and the beautiful? There's a footnote there, and all I could trace it back to was the term was used by Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant, but it doesn't say how they used it. Are they just using it like we think, like, you know, beauty in the arts and music and
I think so. I used a different translation, and they just referred back to it as our a 19th century expression, meaning everything, as you say, in the arts and in the soul. I think we had. Let's go here.
Just a quick comment.
Yeah, and then we're going to go over to you guys.
I mean, he refers also, I think later in the text, you know, sometimes there's pleasure in just smashing something.
Yes.
You know, I guess. But
that's we're going to definitely get to that.
I think in reading these you know, passages, I couldn't help but think that he's almost referring to a cathartic experience that one has when they're face something that's sort of maybe humiliating or embarrassing or somewhat dark, I guess. I could be off track in saying that, but I guess me personally, I've had experiences where I've sort of had an experience of, you know, I guess some pleasure, I guess, of like knowing that everything I thought up to that point was sort of shattered, and through that sort of rough experience, I guess. So in that I found pleasure because I found like a new insight into, you know, I guess that's kind of vague, but you know, I tried to go somewhere, but it didn't go where I wanted it to. But
you felt despair.
Yeah. I felt, well, it was basically my older sister telling me just how selfish I am, how, you know, pitiful I am, and things like. She brought me down to the point where I felt so vulnerable that it was so.
Look, if it's any help, we'll do that here right now.
Right, and say like, but within that, I found a new pleasure, being like, okay, well, totally, she did a great injustice to me, but at the same time, I feel revitalized to sort of change my momentum, I guess, because I've been brought down so low that I can only sort of go high from there. I don't know, just.
Well, I think what you said at the end is what's critical. He said, Patrice, I forgot your name.
Javier.
Javier, he said, I don't know. And you see, I think that's the key point. It's a mechanism which is very hard to explain rationally. What exactly is going on here? Why would you feel pleasure from being smeared with feces? It's just, it's part of the point I would reply to you. It's very hard using, so to speak, rational language to explain these kinds of pleasures. What is going on here? Why is it when I'm sitting in class, I'm trying to concentrate on this professor's exposition, and suddenly these thoughts start, you know, crawling into my mind. I can't keep them out. What's going on? Well, I don't think it can be explained. It can be, as Javier attempted to do, he tried to describe what's happening, but describing it is very different than giving a rational account of the mechanism. And I think what Dostoevsky is saying is there isn't a rational account of the mechanism. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about the previous two comments, that I think the sublime would have evoked the eternal. At the time Dostoevsky is writing, he's writing to a very churched population, and he predates absurdism and really any kind of relativism. And so I think what he's, I mean, existentialism is about to usher in, and I think he's saying, like, you know, there is relative experience, and then, you know, in the 20th century that just becomes the thing. But yeah, I think he's kind of leading the way on kind of what you're saying. So,
Philip?
That too. One was, it feels very S-like. Warner Earhart and its humiliation of people. It could be like Landmark Forum today. And the other is, you talked about, just for clarification, you talked about this early psychology, but this is pre-Freud, it's more like William James, 1860. So
I think it's towards the the end of the 19th century and coming into the 20th century, and you could see these notions as, I forgot who was it, as Erin said, you could see, no, it wasn't Erin, who was it said sadomasochism? Yeah.
The book Venus in Fur, that's like the first, that's where masochism came from, by Leopold von Sadomasochism. I think it came out around the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone else have a comment? Erin, Shannon? Erin first, and Shannon.
Just about like why would the pleasures be irrational? I think with respect to this idea of like early psychoanalytic thought, I mean, people have superegos and they have this internalized voice that tells them what's good, wherever it comes from, probably some mix of nature and upbringing. And maybe the pleasure comes from defying that, I think, to an extent, to knowing that you're acting against what your instinct or your custom says is what's right. And I think it is like the sublime in Kant. I think there's also an element of, it's when you witness something that's so great, so overwhelming aesthetically that you feel sort of annihilated personally. And in that moment, you also have an experience of freedom, because yourself being canceled is also sort of you become aware of yourself as a purely, free agent or being. And I think there's some element of that too in acting against your superego and doing these disgusting things. It's an experience of freedom that you're otherwise denied.
Does everyone know what the superego refers to? Just quickly, it's just the notion that super just means above. So you internalize this external authority which controls or puts limits, restraints on your ego. And most often, the superego, you don't have to use such highfalutin language. It's the sort of thing like when you're doing something which is wrong, you hear your mother's voice. Or you start, what would my mother think? Or what would my father think? And it's the restraint, because it's they're watching over you, and you've internalized. All it means is to internalize an external authority. And so you carry it around with you, and it gives you, as everybody knows, when you're crawling on all fours and you're being whipped, and the stiletto heels in your testicles, and you're thinking, you feel guilty because you wouldn't want your mother to see you that way, I assume. Maybe it's so I think John is now my enemy. Okay, who was going to say something else? It's a joke.
I'm wondering about the historic context that we put this in.
Mm-hmm.
Sadism, isn't that the Marquis de Sade?
Right, but it's the discovery of the unconscious, subconscious, and all that starts occurring now.
This, I've mentioned it before, St. Augustine is very clear that of the pleasure of pears that he's stolen from a garden that wasn't his, and he says at home his own pears are actually far superior, but these have a special attraction and taste. So I don't really see this as something discovered by Dostoevsky, although the way he puts it and the way he expresses it, the way we sort of figure he's talking about a lot of sex. I don't know that St. Augustine was thinking of that. but he certainly was thinking about it being human nature to be drawn to and attracted to something which is not kosher.
Shannon wanted to say something.
I don't know that I could modernize this, but one of the ways in which I think about it, or I think about it, sometimes at the peak of artistry, at the peak of people's creativity, they have a marriage of despair and depravity. And I think when I put it in terms of artistry, like some artists, maybe R. Kelly, for example. R. Kelly was an artist, one of the most talented artists of our generation. But in the midst of all his creativity and all his contributions, he likes to, as the lady said, golden showers is his thing. Michael Jackson, another creative mind. At the same time, at the peak of his creativity, likes things that we would consider potentially irrational because does not fit the rational consensus of what we deem appropriate. I guess to best process it, if you think of it linearly and 0 being the center, and +6 and -6 are equidistant from center, but if you think of it in a circular motion like a clock, 31 and 29 are the same distance from center. So it depends on which way you go, but they border each other. So even at the height of your most creative, the sublime and the beautiful, you're still just that close to the depraved. So I don't know that they are ever that far apart. That you said, that the peaks and the valleys, they're actually much closer than that, because when you're experiencing one, you're just right next door to the other, if that makes sense.
I kind of understand what you're saying, but whereas you were talking about 31 and 29, I've never gotten past between 1 and 2. So it's all theory to me.
Could I just add something to that? Yeah. I agree with you, and I want to talk about Billy Joel's song, Only the Good Die Young. Mm-hmm. That song is actually about him trying to talk a girl into giving up her virginity, a Catholic girl, and not to feel guilty about it. Mm-hmm. Because he doesn't feel guilty about it. And I grew up Catholic, and I can say that there are, half of my Catholic girlfriends felt guilty if they had premarital sex, and so they didn't do it, or they did it and then they felt guilty. The other half did not feel guilty about it one bit. And I just sort of feel like, getting to what you said, like those two sides are very close to each other, and it's not just one or the other. It's not like for sure you're going to feel shame if you do this. Like, some people really don't.
I spoke to a young lady once, and she was a friend of one of my nephews, and she commented that she had an interest in one of her college professors, but she didn't want to pursue it further. Number one, because she went to FIT, and she felt that when she...
Would you give the professor's name, please?
No. that I won't do, but she commented on one hand that when she has not had a lot of sex, she's more creative and more artistic, and she creates more, but when she's active, she loses that creativity. Additionally, she did not want to commit anything with this teacher because she would feel like he won, and I didn't understand that. And I said, well, if you both do it, don't you both win? But she felt that there was some essence of her losing her power or losing some aspect of herself, and I couldn't relate, because every time I feel like I win. So,
Shannon, Teo, he's referring to tennis.
When I think about...
and the teacher was his tennis coach.
When I think about the sublime...
Was that right?
and the beautiful, you think back to like creation story. We all hear about the story of Adam and Eve. And then the serpent came by, Maybe he did it in a way that Adam never did, So Eve just went overboard. She confronted that shadow self. She pushed herself beyond. And in pushing yourself beyond, you go for the reward. You go for the risk, you accept the reward. And then you merge. Mm-hmm. And that's where Esther speak, sweet nectar of the gods. You taste it, you like it, you enjoyed it.
What church is she going to? Okay, next passage. And I was being criticized for veering off the text. Okay, 1 second.
Can I say one quick thing? Since it came up so much, there's a great book by Gilles Deleuze, which is paired with the book by Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, Venus in Furs, and the essay by Deleuze is called Coldness and Cruelty. And it's a great sort of separation. He doesn't like the phrase sadomasochism because it's kind of like conflates these two very separate theories, and so he kind of does, reworking of Freud and like actually goes into the two different theories, just because it came up so much.
Okay. Let's see. The next thing he has to say in his brief against reason, it's a little bit more complex, but I find it infinitely interesting because I think, as always, there's more than just a small amount of truth. There's a lot of truth to it. He says that, and I'm going to use the old translation, the one I prefer, because this is actually a god-awful translation and shows you that the main job of publishers and editors is how to ruin texts. But his main point is, and I know Morin will resonate to it because it was something she was saying all semester, he says, to think too much is a disease, a real, actual disease. To think too much is a disease, a real, actual disease. And his main claim is going to be that when you think too much, you don't do. That reason breeds impotence, not as a sexual act, but as an act of doing. Too much thinking in the end prevents you from acting. So he says on page 5, he says, a man of character, it's a little bit in the middle, who did I give my book to? Is it underlined there? Yeah, that's the problem. You see, I'm trying to find it. Yeah, let's swap, yeah.
Michael thought I was like a genius.
Underlined all of the relevant text. That's impressive. Great mind over here.
It should be obvious that that's not the case. Around 15 lines down, a man of character, a man of action, is primarily a very limited creature. A man of character, a man of action, is primarily a very limited creature. On the next page, he says, and here's that god-awful translation, in section 2, around 4 lines down, he says, I assure you, gentlemen, that to be excessively conscious is a disease, a real, full-blown disease. You should translate in your own mind, because it's the better translation. I assure you, gentlemen, that to think too much is a disease, a real, actual disease. For the needs of everyday life, ordinary human consciousness should be more than sufficient. That is, half or even a quarter less than the portion which falls to the lot of educated men. That is so bad, it makes you want to cry. So, I'm going to give you the correct translation. 1 second. The correct translation, I don't know what happened to this person. I once had a typesetter who was on drugs, and I think the same thing happened here. I swear to you, just listen up, I swear to you that to think too much is a disease, a real, actual disease. For ordinary human life, it would be more than sufficient to possess ordinary human intellectual activity. That is to say, half or a quarter as much as falls on the lot of an educated man. That for most of life, we don't really need all this intellectual activity, and in fact, we could do just fine with half or even a quarter of what an allegedly intelligent person possesses. And then he says on pages 6 through 7, at the very bottom, I'm firmly convinced that not only a great deal of consciousness, but even any amount of consciousness is a disease. I'm firmly convinced that not only a great deal, I'm going to give you the better translation. I'm firmly convinced that not only a great deal, but every kind of intellectual activity is a disease. I see somebody shaking her head. So let's see, what is his explanation for that? Why is thinking too much a disease? A real, actual disease? Theo has a very perplexed look on his face.
I'm thinking too much.
You're thinking too much. But in fact, as you're going to see now, there is an argument here. Let's start on page, the way the book is constructed, as you know, Dostoevsky starts a thought, drops it, goes off on a tangent, then another tangent, then another tangent, and only in this case, some 15 pages later, does he return to the thought he was looking at. And wait. Let's start with page 9. We'll start with page 9. Sorry about that. Let's start with now, just to the first section, and I'll tell you when to stop. Now, with those people
who, for example, know how to take revenge and generally stand up for themselves, how do they do it? They are so obsessed, let's suppose, by this feeling of revenge that during that time all that remains in their entire being is this feeling. This kind of gentleman simply heads straight for his goal, like a maddened bull with lowered horns, and is stopped only by a wall.
Okay. He's talking about one of those human sentiments or emotions, exacting revenge for a slight that was inflicted on you, exacting revenge for a crime that was committed against you. And he wants to ask, how do people take revenge? And he says, now with those people who, for example, know how to take revenge and generally stand up for themselves, and here he's going to be talking about the people of limited intellect, who don't think too much. What do they do? How do they do it? Well, they get so obsessed, let's suppose, by this feeling of revenge, that during that time, all that remains in their entire being is this feeling. This kind of gentleman simply heads straight for his goal like a maddened bull with lowered horns and is stopped only by a wall. When you're a person of limited intelligence, says Dostoevsky, when somebody smacks you, somebody hits you, somebody insults you, you don't think about it, you don't ponder it, you don't try to understand it, comprehend it. Why did he do it? You just act and you exact your revenge. Skip a little now to, so it's precisely
So, it's precisely this kind of spontaneous man whom I consider the real, normal person, such as tender Mother Nature herself wished to see him, as she lovingly brought him into being on this earth.
Okay, let's be clear. The person of limited intellect, says Dostoevsky, the spontaneous man, the one who doesn't think too much, Dostoevsky says, that's a normal person. That's a real person. That's what Mother Nature intended us to be. That's how she, meaning Mother Nature, brought us into this earth. And now Dostoevsky, the thinking man, the one who thinks too much, like Theo with his probing eyes, Dostoevsky says, this kind of man, the spontaneous man, go ahead.
This kind of man makes me green with envy. He is stupid, that I don't dispute with you. But perhaps your normal man ought to be stupid. How do you know?
This kind of man, he makes me green with envy. He's stupid, I won't argue with you. Yeah, he's a lunkhead. But perhaps your normal man ought to be stupid. How do you know?
Keep going.
I'm checking here. Yes, keep going.
Perhaps it's even a very fine thing. And I'm all the more convinced of this suspicion, so to speak, because if one takes, for example, the antithesis of the normal man, that is, the man of heightened consciousness, who of course has not sprung from the bosom of nature, but from a test tube.
So he's saying the person, the intellect, the person of higher consciousness, he says these are not normal people. They're products of a test tube. They are artificial. They are concoctions or brews that come out of a test tube. This is, go ahead.
This is already verging on mysticism, gentlemen, but I'm suspicious of that too. Then this test tube man will sometimes capitulate when confronted with his antithesis, to such a degree that for all his heightened awareness, he will in all good conscience consider himself a mouse and not a man. Granted, an intensely aware mouse, but a mouse all the same.
Now skip down to, but now let's take a look at this mouse in action.
But now let's take a look at this mouse in action. Let's suppose, for example...
The mouse meaning the intellectual person. Go ahead.
Let's suppose, for example, that
okay, now skip down to finally. Finally we come to the deed itself.
Finally we come to the deed itself, the act of revenge. In addition to that original nastiness, the hapless mouse has this time managed to accumulate so much additional nastiness in the form of questions and doubts. It has piled up so many other unresolved questions in addition to the original problem that it has involuntarily surrounded itself with a lethal brew, a stinking bog consisting of its doubts and emotions, and finally of the spittle showered on it by all the spontaneous men of action, solemnly gathered around in the guise of judges and dictators who are laughing their heads off at it.
Okay, and now I'll explain it. I know it's a little confusing, but I promise you it's going to become perfectly clear. Turn to page 16, and this is a long passage. Are you up for reading it?
Yeah.
Okay. Page 16, 4 lines down. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it in reverse. I'm going to explain what he's saying, and then we're going to read it, because he puts it in a much better way than my explanation. So, he's going to say the following. He's going to say, if you're a person of limited consciousness, a person of limited intelligence, if somebody strikes you, you strike them back. You don't think about it. It's a kind of reflex, as Mother Nature intended us to be. But he says, what happens when you're a person of higher consciousness. He says, you have this problem. The problem is this. The person of limited consciousness, he has a firm ground to stand on. He hit me, I hit him. He has a primary cause for his action. He has a primary cause for his own exaction of revenge. But what happens when you're a person of higher consciousness? Somebody, here's person, we'll call this person A, and person A wants to exact revenge on person B. And because person B, let us say, assaulted him, mugged him. So he says, okay, now I have my reason, he assaulted me. But then he starts thinking, well, why did he assault me? Well, probably he assaulted me because he was angry. But why was he angry? He says, well, he probably was angry because his parents didn't love him. And why did his parents not love him? Well, probably his mother was a drug addict and his father was an alcoholic. And why was his mother a drug addict and his father an alcoholic? Probably because they were born into poverty. And why were they born into poverty? Probably because of the economic system. And then Dostoevsky says, because of these damned laws of consciousness, he says, like by chemical decomposition, all of your anger dissipates and you no longer can find a grounds for revenge. What am I avenging? And he says you end up doing nothing. Whereas it would probably be better, Dostoevsky seems to say, if you did something rather than turn yourself into a mouse. So let's see how he says it. Go ahead, John.
Starting where?
After all,
the immediate, legitimate, direct fruit of consciousness is inertia. That is, consciously sitting, twiddling your thumbs. I've mentioned this before. I repeat most emphatically, all spontaneous people and men of action are active because they are dull-witted and limited. What is the explanation for this? Well, it's like this. As a result of their limitations, they take immediate and secondary causes for primary ones.
They take the smack in the face, the spittle that's been deposited on your face, they take that as the primary cause. They don't think why that person smacked me or spit on me. Go ahead.
As a result of their limitations, they take immediate and secondary causes for primary ones and are thus persuaded more quickly and easily than others that they have found an indisputable basis for whatever they do, and so they are reassured. And that's the main thing. You see, in order to begin to act, you must be completely sure in advance that there are no residual doubts whatsoever. But how can I, for example, reassure myself?
I meaning the intellectual. Go ahead.
Where are my primary causes on which I can take a stand? Where are my foundations? Where shall I take them from? I practice thinking, and consequently, every primary cause immediately draws another in its wake.
So just look up. Every primary cause draws another in its wake. You keep going backwards.
One that is even more primary, and so on ad infinitum. And that is precisely the essence of all thought processes or self-awareness. Again, this must therefore be the laws of nature. And what is the final result? Well, exactly the same. Remember that I was talking of revenge not so long ago. You probably didn't get my meaning very well. I said that a man avenges himself because he finds justice in it. That means he has found his primary cause, has found a basis for his actions, namely, justice.
He hit me, I hit him. That's justice. And he says when you start thinking too much, you can no longer find any justice, any grounds for your action. Go ahead.
Therefore, he is completely reassured on all counts and consequently takes his revenge calmly and successfully, convinced that what he is doing is just and honorable. But for the life of me, I can see neither justice here nor virtue, and consequently, if I start taking my revenge, it's really out of spite. Spite, of course, can overcome everything, all my doubts, and therefore I could quite successfully serve instead of a primary cause for the simple reason that it's not a cause. But what can I do if I don't even feel spite? After all, that's what I began with a short time ago. Again, as a result of those damned laws of consciousness, my spite is subject to chemical decomposition.
That's actually a great line. It's not the greatest translation, but because of those damned laws of consciousness, my spite, my anger, my revenge, it's subject to chemical decomposition.
Just look, and the object vanishes into thin air. Reasons
Look
evaporate.
at the line, even in a crummy translation, it's still so perfect. Just look, the object, the purpose of my revenge, I want to get revenge, it vanishes into thin air. Reasons evaporate. I don't have a reason anymore. Go ahead.
The culprit is nowhere to be found.
We're already back at the economic system. Go ahead.
And the offense is no longer an offense, but becomes destiny. Something in the nature of a toothache for which no one is to blame.
He had to do what he did because of this, and this, and this, and this. And the person who you want to exact revenge on, he simply becomes the product, the outcome of destiny. He couldn't be anything else except what he was. So then how can you exact revenge?
Something in the nature of a toothache for which no one is to blame, and consequently there again remains the same way out. That is, banging your head against the wall so that it hurts even more. And so you give it up as a bad job because you failed to find a primary cause.
And now he has a great line. He says, but then let's say you say, the hell with all of this, tracing it back. I'm going to exact revenge anyway. Without looking at the text, what happens the next day if you're one of the persons of heightened consciousness, you ignore all this reasoning and you exact revenge? What happens the next day? Say it.
You feel guilty.
You feel guilty. In other words, you lose if you exact revenge, and you lose if you don't exact revenge. If you say the hell with it, and you act like the lunkhead, you still don't get satisfaction because you feel guilty because you know you did it and you didn't really have any reason to do it. Go ahead. But just you try letting yourself...
That's right. But just you try letting yourself be carried along blindly by your emotions, without reasoning, without primary cause, banishing your consciousness at least for the time being. Hate or love, do anything but sit there not doing a stroke. The day after tomorrow, at the very least, you'll begin to despise yourself for having knowingly deceived yourself.
Okay. So, let me give you an example which this passage always evokes in me, and then you can react to it or give your own example. So, there I was, 1979. Yes, I am that old, even though I was just born the year before. 1979, there I was in Dusseldorf, Germany. And my late mother, she was in Majdanek concentration camp, and she was asked to testify at the trial for the guards at the camp. There was the last, at that point, I don't know since, it was the last major trial of Nazi war criminals, concentration camp guards in Germany. And she was called as a witness because she had, one of the guards in the camp lived in Maspeth, Queens. Her name was Hermione Braunsteiner. And she lived in Maspeth, Queens. She was found, and my mother was at the INS hearing where she was, her testimony had the woman deported, and then because she had lied on the forms for coming into the US. Obviously, she didn't say former job concentration camp guard. And then there was a trial after she was deported, but it was not just her, it was a large number of guards. And I accompanied my mother to the trial. And first my mother was completely shocked, bewildered, because the guards were just walking freely in the courthouse. We thought that they would be incarcerated, but they were just treated the same way as you would be treated for having not picked up after your dog. And then we were sitting in the courtroom, and 40 years had elapsed already, 35 years had elapsed already, and in the concentration camp, the inmates weren't allowed to actually make eye contact with the guards. So you didn't exactly know who they were. You could see them in the distance, but up front, no. And the guards were asked to stand up. Their names were given, and you could identify them by virtue of their names, not their physical appearance, because you knew their names in the camp. And I remember when one of the guards, well, all four of them really, but one in particular, her name was Brigitte. She stood up. She was a very large woman now, and she was wearing a pleated skirt and a very drab blouse. And my mother, who was something of a snob, which she for certain was, she turned to me and she whispered, "I can't believe it. She's a washwoman." Because in my mother's imagination, they were all these lean, what were called at the time, Ubermenschen, supermen, wearing the crisp uniform. And so she had this image of the superwoman, and then suddenly she sees her in the courtroom, and she said, "Oh my God, she's a washwoman." So my mother was very agitated, and she started to scream in the corridor, "Why are these animals allowed to walk? Freely? Why aren't they in the cage?" And truth be told, she was, as I later learned, because a friend of mine was an expert on the trials, a German friend of mine, and the prosecutor found my mother to be a very uncooperative witness, which in fact she was, and I didn't give a darn about that. But after she had delivered her testimony that night, we were walking out of the courthouse into the street. And as if John is on this side of me, as close as Abdullah is on my side of me, I turned. It was Brigitte. And Brigitte was the most notorious, that's why I remember her name, she was the most notorious guard in the camp. She had used to come out with German shepherds into the field, and she was really, as the expression has it, a nasty piece of work. So she's right to my right. I didn't know what to do there. And I waited for her to walk down maybe as far as James is the camera person. And when she had gotten that far, I turned to my mother and I said, "Do you know who that is?" And my mother squinted, and then her eyes lit up. She said, "Brigitte?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "What do you want me to do?" And she said, "Get her! Get her! They think we're sheep! Get her!" I was kind of torn. Because on the one hand, I knew if I did nothing, for all my talk about being a radical and armed struggle and all the rest, Mom would think I'm a mouse. And she'd never talk to me again, for sure. This was no joke. You could smile, but this was business. And she didn't care if I got killed. I can tell you that. Get her, get her. They think we're sheep. This was like an affront on the magnitude which leaves you breathless. You're going to walk next to us in a Dusseldorf evening after my mother was incarcerated in that camp and her whole family was exterminated? But the other side of me said, she's a washwoman. It's like, we have an expression in Yiddish, a shmata, a rag. It's like me beating a rag, a shmata, pummeling a rag. What's the point of it? It's like beneath contempt. What am I doing? I'm proving I'm a man? It wasn't that I was afraid. I couldn't quite see the point of it. Would you beat a garbage pail? She was like a garbage can. She was like a garbage can. There was another guard, her name was Perelka, who my mother actually conceded she wasn't so terrible. And she was walking down the stairs in front of us. This was before that night. And my mother started calling in Polish, I guess, kurwiasz, which means whore, kurwiasz, you know. She was this little plump woman. For those of you who know the comedian Toady Fields, you can Google it, T-O-T-I-E. You look at Toady Fields, this little fat woman. I could have gone over and pushed her down the stairs, but what was the point? What am I proving? So the question is, and we'll just go around the room because I'm curious, did I think too much? And was thinking too much a real, actual disease? Should I just, I can't say, even if I won't say what happened, but as I think you suggested, whatever you do when you think too much, you lose. What should you do? Should I have done something or not?
I think most of the time you can only really do what feels right to you. And so despite your mother asking you to do something, imploring that you do something.
Demanding. Imploring, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Demanding.
Yeah. She
Yeah.
wasn't begging me, she was,
Right.
You're going to kill that woman.
Okay. But yeah, I don't know. And then I think you weigh the consequences, and then
Should you
all of
weigh
a
the
sudden-
consequences
then all
or
of a
just
sudden
do
we're back where we
something?
started, yeah.
Well, what do you say?
How old were you then?
79, so I was 25.
Oh, okay. Huh.
26.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a hard call.
Hard call. No. You have to ask the question, is Dostoevsky right? Does reason breed impotence? does it? To think too much is a disease, a real actual disease, and maybe it's better to be a little bit stupid. That's what he says. Maybe it's better to be a little bit stupid.
I think rule number one in the art of war is to not see the other person's perspective. So I think if you don't think, that's what you end up with.
Should, in those circumstances, you trouble yourself with the other person's perspective? Is it normal, or is that a test tube answer? Dostoevsky says it's not normal. Mother Nature intended us to be a little bit stupid.
I think with reconciliation, I remember seeing Desmond Tutu speak once, and he said, revolution is so easy, but reconciliation, that's really hard. That's the really hard work, and that's how they made things a little bit better in South Africa.
Everybody has the right to agree or disagree. I'm kind of Old Testament Jewish. Never to forgive, never to forget. I have no desire to reconcile with monsters. And I would add that you can answer me. Don't be afraid to. I know I'm very tough now, but I want to say, I don't think you have the right to reconcile. Only the victims can reconcile, and they're dead. If they want to reconcile, let them go ahead and come back from the grave and reconcile. But I'm not reconciling for the dead.
Okay, but you didn't attack either of the women.
I'm not going to say what I did.
Oh, maybe you did. Sorry, I assumed you
I'm
did
not going to say what I did.
I think there might be a better way than just using a brute response.
Didn't you write a book on Gandhi?
Yes.
This is before then. This is before then.
I want to say, we have to be fair. Carrington said, revenge is easier than reconciliation. The question is, in those circumstances, should you reconcile or should you exact revenge? And is reconciliation, painful as it may sound, the excuse of a mouse? Cecilia?
Adding to what Carrington said, I recently led a book discussion at my church on Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama, the Book of Joy. And it kind of coincided with that week with John Lewis, the senator who Trump was just not being kind to. And
John Lewis was genuinely, it's easy to say, I don't like what he's become, but facts are facts. During the Civil Rights Movement, he was a saint and a hero of the First Order. He went out, he was beaten brutally and mercilessly, he endured injuries for life, and he displayed kinds of courage which can only make shivers go down your spine.
Yeah, and they had written up something that when, just like you said, when he was younger, the police officer then who rode the horse and kicked him in his head, he heard about him through Trump. He thought he had died or whatever. But he said, I think he lived in some other state, but he traveled to Washington. He said, I need to see John Lewis. I need to tell him in person. His kids were like, no, you could write him. He said, no, I need, for my soul, I need to see him in person to right the wrongs and tell him how sorry I am. So he traveled to Washington and he met John Lewis, and he was, a bit, scared at what he would do. And John Lewis hugged him. So it's human to feel your parents' pain. And revenge is human. But in that instance, you have to make amends. You cannot go into tomorrow's carrying yesterday's burden. At one point, you have to make amends. You have to make peace with the past. And that way, forgiveness comes in. It's not so much that you excuse another person's action. Otherwise, you will carry that burden to the end of your days.
I'm listening to every word you say. I'm listening to every word you say. Go ahead. What do you say?
Oh, and when you come to the crossroads, you choose love.
Preach.
Drop mic.
Yeah, you choose love. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm not ignoring. I'm listening. Go ahead. What do you say?
So I just have a thought. I didn't read the text, and I'm not reading it as you're going through it, but I'm kind of like connecting what we're saying now to what we started with. We started with this question of this man banging his head against the wall, and kind of like this reality of, on the level of 2 + 2, that he's just not willing to accept. And I'm connecting it through all these readings that we've been going through. And I see the reality that he's not willing to accept is not so much the reality of death, but the reality of man not really being a rational being. It's a being that's ruled by subconscious urges that make no sense. And that's the real nature, this nature on top that we think of as the rational person, the person that we want ourselves to be, that we think of ourselves as, that's not really what we are.
But he's saying something else. He's saying it's better that we're not that way.
But I don't think I think that's,
it wasn't intended that we should be that way.
I think that's kind of like the dilemma. That's the reality that we really are being faced with, but we cannot accept. It's kind of being proven to us on the level of, math, but we can still not accept it. That we have this the level at which anger and pain dissolve, but when you think about it, it's also a reality. It's also a reality. This reality that that the being that hit you, their anger comes from somewhere else and comes from somewhere else. That's also a reality, and it's a reality at which all of the human drama kind of dissolves. It's
Okay, I'm listening. I have to say, Cecilia, for the first time, is making me so angry. I'm just thinking over the things you say.
That's good.
Hug them? Hug them? You feel remorse? A little late in the day. A little late in the day. Teo?
I don't want to answer a question with a question, but I only have questions. I mean, I have some. Okay, so I just wonder why A and B are antipodes. Like, why are they even incompatible, right? I mean, I think it's kind of a false dichotomy. Because, I mean, think of like, I don't see why visceral spontaneity, just sort of crazy outbursts, I don't see why that's incongruent with just being hyperconscious. I mean, I only have examples. I don't have answer. But like Wittgenstein, I think he thought a lot, right? You could describe him as hyperconscious, and he sort of famously just picked up a fire poker and lunged at Karl Popper. Diogenes, one of the great Greek classics, is known for throwing shit and being a general kind of weird, physical, over-aggressive guy. Think about the movie Falling Down with Michael Douglas. There's you ever seen, yeah, like the movie? Yeah. The main character, he designs missiles for a defense company, and he's very smart and very intellectual, and then one day he decides, I'm going to get out of my car and cause a lot of ruckus in, I think it's Los Angeles, right? And he killed some people. And so I just don't see why you can think a lot and still be a victim to basic human nature. I mean, just in my life, sometimes you get called names at school and stuff. You're a faggot, like you have Asperger's, that kind of thing. And one time I got 10 days of community service because I punched a kid in the face. And my parents weren't mad at me at all. They were just, you're going with your day. But and maybe I should have hugged him. But
it's interesting. You're laughing, but should you or shouldn't you?
It felt utterly cathartic and amazing.
But at some level, you realize you punched the guy who was just ignorant. He was stupid. Yeah. So why is it just such a great feeling to punch somebody who said that? Because he's ignorant.
Well, I mean, what's the Martin Luther King?
He didn't benefit from being raised in your family where in 10th grade you're already talking about Liechtenstein.
I probably pronounced it really wrong. I never heard it said.
Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
He just is a victim of his own stupidity. If you had gone back far enough in primary causes, you would have realized what you did was absolutely, totally pointless.
Maybe.
Was it? Did it stop the thing?
Did it? Yes. His name was...
Okay, I'm glad you gave that story, and we'll have time. We have 15 minutes. Let's just try to do it efficiently. Go ahead.
I guess I was thinking in your case, I don't know if you overthink it.
Or his case.
Yeah.
He said it felt great.
Well, see, the difference is, I think it's pretty natural if the injustice was done to someone else 35 years ago, and now the person who did it is an old woman. I think that would cause. Maybe that had more to do with it than overthinking it, right? Is that? I don't know. I saw this. There was this documentary about Indonesian war criminals, and now they're a bunch of old guys. And it's kind of hard just because they're so old. It's kind of hard to work up hatred, I don't know, but
it's an argument.
I don't know. As for what you should have done, I was thinking the two extremes are like do nothing or like beat her to death. Maybe like the middle ground would have been to like slap her. I don't know.
I think that's a pretty mousy middle ground. Next.
So I've been thinking about it. I think that what Dostoevsky is calling a disease of thinking too much is sort of a reflection of the fact that Mother Nature, the bodies we have, like they were evolved to do this hair-sensitive fight or flight, revenge fight, like duke it out. We're in the jungle. There's a lion in the bush. Like those are the bodies we all have. They evolved to do that, and yet we live in a world now where that hair trigger response is reacting to something that's not like imminent life or death. There's not really a lion in the bush, So I think like we have bodies that are going to have those responses. So of course it feels good to defend your ground and stick up for yourself. Like that's what our bodies do. So I guess just assigning like disease, negative, positive, I think it's a product of having brains that don't exactly know how to make sense of all of it and all those triggers and communicate. But given the world we live in, I think like I side with our better angels over here about what we should do, But it's a battle. It's an actual battle.
You would say, Mom, she did what she did because her mother hated her or her mother was cruel. And her mother was cruel because her father was an alcoholic. And her father was an alcoholic because he couldn't find a job. So there's no point in me doing anything. Let's just go to a restaurant.
Well, I'm not advocating for going into the loop. What I'm saying is the part of your brain that wants to punch her and the part of your brain that are going to be thinking of it in those terms genuinely don't know how to communicate with each other very well. So in the moment, what you do is take a deep breath and take like 3 seconds and evaluate. And that might calm some of the fight-flight response.
Okay.
So I am partly with you on that, actually. I'm Quaker, so nonviolence kind of goes with, which I realize is probably not the common majority in here. But so actually, honestly, like on that diagram over there, my thought process actually, honestly, is often close to that B having to kind of go from one to the other, because it's a struggle oftentimes, because like nonviolence is such a big part of that, and the struggle is real, even just on daily life. I mean, passive aggressiveness or anything going on, it's there, and it's like, yeah, no, that racist whatever going on the subway car, yeah, no, okay, gonna find a way to not respond to that person going on. But my question for you, actually, just in your situation, I'm actually kind of more interested, because it seems like you actually had two moments in your situation, and you don't have to answer this because I know you're just listening right now. But it seems like you had two chances with this, impulsive or thinking, rationalizing, and I'm wondering which one you responded with when you ask your mom, "What do you want me to do?"
Because that goes with me to my grave, Maren. Sorry, but that's...
Well, no, I wasn't asking what you did.
Because the truth of the matter is...
Did you think before you said that? Or was that just,
yes, it did run through my mind. You see, the thing is... Remind me of your name? Jack. Jack says, she's an old lady, what the F are you doing beating the daylights out of her? So if I said I did A, I beat the daylights out of her, it doesn't make me look exactly heroic. If I said B, I did nothing, it doesn't make me look very good either. So either way, I'm not telling anyone what I did. Go ahead.
And all of this is going in your head. I would have punched the woman, and without any, and if my head says, no, Miren, you shouldn't, because, I would have told my head, shut up. The problem is that there is no connection between our head, our senses, and our heart, and our guts. We are all in there. And when we have this kind of discussions. Of course you punch the woman. And once you acknowledge that your senses are part of your mind, your heart is part, they all live in your body. It's not just your mind on a shelf, it is a whole. And if they're not connected and they don't check with each other, yes, you should do this, no, you shouldn't, but once in a while, one of the three or four says, that's it is my turn. And I have no problem at all punching the woman. And then...
I'm shocked.
You are shocked?
Yes, I really am. I really am. No, I'm serious. I've known Maren a very long time. I would never have believed you'd say that.
And now, please believe, and I am sure, if you didn't punch the woman, your mother was not happy.
I think I'm having some trouble really just connecting the fact that if someone is a thinking person, that they become a mouse or they're not able to respond or act. I'm really having trouble with that, because I think you can think yourself into violence or you can think yourself out of violence. And I think as a matter of fact, I think someone who is super intelligent probably can commit more grievous harm than someone who responds. So I think they're capable of even greater kind of action, negative or positive. But we are only looking now at the connections you made, which are very positive. You're going back into, what's empathetically, what can I look at? But on the other hand, you can go backwards from point economics and come down and create very grievous harm. So I'm really having...
You can say, the person always had a choice, always had free will. I don't care what you went through. You made a choice. You decided to do that. Now you're getting it back in spades. Yeah, I could...
Aren't there people that don't act, though? Aren't there people that are that do things on a less
what time is it? I don't want to keep the workers.
And wouldn't you associate that with thinking?
What?
You're saying that you can think and then still act, but this phenomenon of someone who doesn't act most of the time, where does that come from?
Is it only linked to thinking, is what you're asking?
Yeah, where does
No, I think inaction can be, the root cause could be many-fold. I don't think it's just because you're thinking.
Like what?
You might at that moment be very vulnerable. You just may not have the strength that is not something you want to get involved in. It could be, it's not necessarily linked to like deep thought. But I think someone capable of that level of deep thought is equally capable of perpetrating heinous crimes using that.
Okay,
faculty.
Phil?
So I'm with the two women on my right. It's complicated, but as a recovering mouse, I know it would be hard for people to believe, but I was a very shy young child who would allow himself to get beaten up until I finally decided to lash back. And it brings a respect and an acknowledgement, and they're never going to come. In this case with the Lewis, some people may come, but you should have kicked the crap out of her. I would have kicked the crap out.
I'm listening.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it very much is a disease, the intellect, and I think like other bacteria or diseases, it comes with a myriad of symptoms, and some serve me and some don't, and so in this case, I do take every step back and that I can, and sometimes that's sufficient, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes I don't have the time, and so I just punch the guy, and that shouldn't come with guilt. It was the thing that I could do in that moment. But had I had the time to walk back, then I believe that the disease served me in that moment, and that was what I.
But I want to ask. I'm hearing you out, but now.
Ma'am, your attention, please. Central Library will be closing in 5.
Okay. I hear every word you're saying, but let's say now, at least in our circumstance, you have the time to look back. I understand what you're saying in the moment, but now when you look back, what was the right thing to do?
In what scenario? In your scenario? Yeah. I would say inaction, because I think the very intellect that is keeping you, or hopefully allowing, I don't know, like what you were saying, like the mind could get you to do some horrific things, like the things that were done to your mother were done by minds who were presumably thinking very hard about the best society to create. But I don't think a thinking mind is something to avoid for that reason. I think
to think too much is a disease, a real actual disease. And out of respect for the workers, we're going to have to clear out now. Yeah. And if somebody has something to say, you can say it next week. You can just save it, and we can say it next week.